Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll, and this is Black Cats Run. On today's episode, we explore the dynamics that influence people to make the kinds of choices that they make, what allows us to be effective in our decision-making process, what causes us to be ineffective. Is it possible for us to, by changing our perspectives or our mindset on the kinds of factors that influence our decisions, to get to a point where we can have more success trying to achieve our goals? We're calling this one the Immersion Complex. Let's get into today's episode. So a core aspect that we want to start with here is trying to understand, trying to come up with some way to articulate what is the basic mechanism by which we seem to be making decisions and evaluations about stuff in general. And I would think of this as sticker labeling. And by sticker labeling, I mean that we look usually for what is the most obvious, readily expressed, most easy to perceive indicator or communicator of what something is. And labeling as a general phenomena, right, is not new, but I'm specifically calling it sticker labeling, which obviously stickers are not a new invention. They're more contemporary than, antiquity, of course, but they're not like new, to society this year. It's been around for a while, obviously. You're just putting a little adhesive on the back of something. And what that did is it created a really easy and effective way to introduce a label or a concept to an object. And you go into a grocery store, you usually walk through the produce section. And I think a part of this is probably by design to sort of make us feel that, the grocery store is a sort of more wholesome food environment, when the reality is the overwhelming majority of goods in a grocery store for sale are sold as some form of dry goods that are boxed and preserved. And that's like, if you eliminated all of that, all you would really have left basically would be that initial space. But by bringing you through those initial areas of sort of more dynamic sort of food space of, here's fruit, vegetables, maybe it brings you by the, deli counter, maybe it brings you through the bakery section, depending on the layout of the store, right? That's having an impact on how we perceive our experience. And, not every grocery store does this, but, it's a strategy that you see being used. And with that produce, right, there are competitors in that space, people producing different products, people trying to get different people to consume their oranges versus somebody else's oranges, and, bananas, avocados. And a lot of times, this differentiation is made off of taking, sometimes something smaller than a fingernail, but a sticker about that size with an icon or a logo and sticking it on that fruit. And that somehow, right, changes our perception of the value or the significance of that item, and that we then make decisions based on that sticker. And that sticker labeling effect is really powerful in causing people to reach conclusions about what actions they should or should not take in any given instance. And I think this phenomena raises the question, first of all, is this a aspect that, happens in a non-literal sticker labeling sense in society? Do we as individuals, through our own action or as individuals acted upon by society, do we find ourselves, a product of or influenced by the sticker labeling phenomena, the ease in which we can communicate a seemingly substantive significance that might not actually be grounded in any kind of like evident truth? Do we see that as something that is like a common practice or common issue influencing our decision-making processes as we move through life and make all of the choices that we make? And we're constantly making choices. I mean, some of the choices are so automatic that we've sort of ingrained them to the point where they're just a force of habit. And the idea of making a different choice is so abstract to us that we wouldn't necessarily even think of it as a choice. But everything we do is a choice by some means, because there's always an alternative. It's just that alternative is sometimes so undesirable that it doesn't feel like it's a choice. And we change that, right? We look at the costs and benefits of those choices, right? Influences our thought process as we take those steps day to day, and then in our longer term processes, that's where we usually start to feel more like we're making choices, because those are where we're stepping out of these practices of ingrained habit and routine, and we are forced to try to use our brains a little bit more actively and dynamically, and stretch our ability for cognitive reasoning. And in making these choices, oftentimes what we're doing, right, is we're trying to find some basis of reasoning. And this sticker labeling effect, I think, points to the fact that we take the simplest, most readily available indicator of sort of significance or value, and we pursue that. But we also know that we're oftentimes sort of very able to be immune to the significance of labels. Putting a Surgeon General's warning on cigarettes hasn't exactly stopped society from smoking cigarettes. And what you're looking at there is like this, these multiple competing stickering values, right? The value of, whatever sort of marketing is leveraged, by the brand that is selling the product, versus the value of the, brand of, the Surgeon General or the, federal government trying to, communicate some information, because the reality is people who sell cigarettes do not have the best interest of the consumer at heart. That's a great example, right, of how sticker labeling isn't necessarily this thing done to provide us a, essential service or value. It doesn't necessarily positively influence our process. And then we also have sort of the non-visible, but I think still very much sticker labeled phenomena of, is smoking cigarettes something that, feels countercultural to people? Do they feel that they are, engaging in some sort of like a fundamental act of self-expression or vitality? The idea that smoking cigarettes is something that's sort of more life-affirming is kind of odd, because, developing the kinds of, illnesses and diseases. You would think, frankly, that just the impact on your oral health and your breath and just how just generally disgusting they are would be enough. But, to not even want people to get to the point of long-term consequence. But you see that, people, pursue these things. And, obviously addiction is a phenomena too, but it's also the case that, when there was sort of a broad shift in terms of like, oh, wait, cigarettes, they don't cure asthma and they're not this, that, and the other thing. People just stopped, right? An overwhelming majority of people just stopped smoking for the most part. And so, right, what that means is that, not everybody is, as subjected to that. Addiction is a more complex, variable behavior than drug resistance training education, drug and alcohol resistance education would have us think. So I think that, there's a lot of evidence then, right, to sort of say that we can take this sticker labeling phenomena, right, out of the domain of, the fruits and vegetables section of a grocery store and extend that phenomena to something else. Although it is interesting to think that you see stickers on the fruits, but you don't really see stickers on the potatoes. And is that because the value, the competition value, or the sort of appeal of potatoes is sort of just so ubiquitous and generic and sort of like not exciting that the need to sort of like compete in that space is different. It's also probably harder to grow fruit than to grow potatoes, but this is not an agricultural podcast, nor am I qualified to comment on that in any way, shape, or form. Not that that's ever stopped me before. But so I think we can then ask the question about the sticker labeling phenomena. How do the perceptions of others, whether they're real or equally powerful, sometimes maybe more powerful, or if they're imagined, how do those perceptions impact the decisions that people make? Right? And that's when I emphasize that again. It can be real perceptions or it can be imagined perceptions. And I think that these are equally powerful because it's the operative word is really perception, right? Because I think to us, if we have a perception, it is functionally real. And we could externally, especially when we're evaluating other people or other situations, we can sort of discriminate between what we think is a real, phenomena versus an imagined phenomena. But, if it is sort of tangible and impactful to somebody, it's real to them because it is having an influence, right? So real is anything that influences people's behavior in this kind of context when we talk about perception, but we also externally can say, how validated or grounded or essential is it to take on that aspect of perception if there's also this other dynamic in which we can evaluate it and say, okay, that's not like fundamentally evident. That's not fundamentally true. So that leads me to a hypothesis. If the perception of a consensus opinion, real or imagined, is strong enough, then people will perceive actions and choices as dichotomous and make decisions to alleviate nonconformity stress. Okay, let's say that again. If the perception of a consensus opinion, be it real or imagined, is strong enough, then people will perceive actions and choices to be dichotomous and make decisions to alleviate nonconformity stress. Okay, so what do we mean by this hypothesis? Well, first of all, right, I think what we're most susceptible to is the perception of, what is the consensus of what we should or shouldn't be doing, right? And that sticker labeling, right, is this, it's coming from somewhere, and there's sort of this authoritative energy to that, I suppose you could say, because it's this notion that, well, when you're looking at these kinds of phenomena and trying to understand them, we're looking for sort of some guidance, right? And I think if we felt wholly competent, right, and by the way, there's evidence that suggests that the more competent people might feel, the less competent they might actually be. We've talked about that Dunning-Kruger effect on other episodes, but something to consider here too. But at any rate, what we're looking at is that if we feel that it's a consensus or it's like sort of the commonly understood phenomena, that it must be true. And that's that sticker labeling effect, that if there's a sticker, well, that seems somehow like official or real or validated to us, right? It's hard to differentiate between the potatoes because they don't have anything sort of on them. But if you have bananas with stickers on them, and then if you have bananas with no stickers, I think people are more likely to consume the bananas with stickers, unless you're at a, organic foods co-op context, in which case maybe it would be the opposite effect. But there's going to be prevalence, right? And there's also the star-bellied sneetches phenomenon for those of you Dr. Seuss, fans. But again, right, the real or imagined component we're emphasizing here. And if, right, it's strong enough. So it's the degree to which we perceive or assign sort of consensus-like status to a sticker, right? And we've defined, by the way, just to be clear, we've defined stickers as phenomena that can be validated or can be abstract. And or in different terms, that it might be a literal sticker, right? Or it might not be like something that you can explicitly point to and say, aha, there's the sticker, but like we all recognize that it has essentially been labeled, that it's had some sort of label imposed upon it. And so then what we're perceiving is the label and the values that the label is trying to translate to us versus actually processing the item or the good in question. And I think what this does is it creates this sense of like, well, this one has the sticker, the desired sticker, and then these other ones don't. So that means there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. And so that then becomes a dichotomy, that things can be sorted into essentially two categories, and that, there's this, you're doing this thing that's right and you're doing this thing that's wrong. And, of course, we're going to get more and more into the connections to, training and endurance sport, but probably conditioning and training and preparation and practice for many different kinds of things that people want to improve at. But, to just throw in an initial connection, it would be the perception of, if you're a runner, should I do 5 times a mile, right? And then you're going to agonize over how much rest you should take, because everybody's heard of 5 by mile as a workout. So we don't question that, right? That's been clearly labeled. But, the idea of the rest interval is not really explained and what should be done there, right? And so then we don't know what to do, and we go into crisis because we don't know if the choice we're going to make is going to be the good choice or the bad choice. And the belief then is if we make the bad choice, we've totally failed. And that's where we get to that point of nonconformity stress, that it's not just this social anxiety of a desire to fit in, but it's this sense of consequence, right? Like, why would we fear being non-conforming in the first place? Well, we fear things because we fear the potential consequence of them. Now, maybe our ability to articulate and comprehend that consequence can be, very like easy and straightforward, and maybe sometimes it can defy any kind of like articulation. But fear is driven by some concept of consequence, and that anxiety is driven by some concept of consequence, that we need to avoid that negative outcome. And when those things become what we would define as irrational, it's when our perception of that stuff is extremely influential, and we have the driving compulsion to get out from under that feeling, but there's no like actual thing, that exists in any kind of validated form that we're reacting to, right? And that's where we get into those two different kinds of real. There's what's real to us in a process of thinking and deciding, and then there's what's real in terms of other like perspectives, right? Like, what can we actually define, in a genuine rational sense as being real? And I think we can, look at this as a kind of Nash equilibrium. One of my favorite, concepts from economics is the Nash equilibrium, which, we've covered this before. But again, the Nash equilibrium is the notion that, the most sort of optimal outcome for competitors is to be as close to the competitors in strategy and approach as possible. And this nonconformity stress, I think, is something that is very much tied into, a concept like Nash equilibrium, that we believe it to be most competitively optimal to do the same kinds of things. And that's why if you look at athletic stuff online, whether it's people doing workout videos or vlogs, or people posting content on Instagram or what have you, it's all rooted in that basic core, concept of people are all creating very, very, very similar things. And I think a really powerful example of this actually happens in writing. And it's not just limited to this, but it's easier to talk about the contemporary before you talk about the historical for most people, because the contemporary is where we have the strength of intellectual familiarity. But, the kind of banalities that drive the construction of people's descriptions on, Instagram are very much like insipid. It's, loathsome to have to try to read and process some of the stuff, and have to, right? Obviously we don't have to, but it's sort of presented to you so much that it starts to feel like it has this same sort of, generic, authorship voice that something like Soviet propaganda would have, and becomes readily recreatable. And I think that's what enables people to recreate it, right? But why would we all do the same thing, even if it's kind of like cringy and awkward, and, using words like humbled and grateful and blah, 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 well, because it's that, nonconformity stress of like, there's this pressure that we feel, people feel like they need to write like that. And there's also the work product example, which is another form of pressure and sticker labeling, that like, that's the only thing that we see. Right. And so like that's what's desirable, and then we talk about things like the algorithm as a way to try to sort of, dissociate ourselves from responsibility for our kind of like lack of creative thinking here. But, I think that at the same time, I don't know how much we can really blame people or ourselves for this, because this sort of fits to that concept. So in that Nash equilibrium of desirability, we can say, right, or a Nash equilibrium of conformity, right, which is that people moving towards behaviors and choices that fit in that consensus, it's like you have this sort of like do behavior. Imagine that point as like a star, right, in an empty space. And the behaviors of people are moving through that space, drawn to that star. Okay, it has a pulling gravitational effect. And the behaviors outside of that star, those are don't behaviors. So you have do behaviors represented by that star floating in space, and then you have the don't behaviors. And in this dichotomous mindset, you have all of this space, and it's this single point that is correct. Okay, and that star in that empty, unclear, ill-defined, ambiguous, vast space, that star is the sticker that is labeling for what we want to do. And those are the do behaviors. And then that is why we exist in a state of dichotomy, because we can categorize things as, the joke, there's two kinds of people in the world, right? People who blank and people who blank, and you can say that about anything, right? And that's why it's so absurd. And, these kinds of concepts, right, become like extremely, extremely limiting, right? But we're willing to accept that because there's, you would think the anxiety should be that, wow, what if this singular point is wrong because it's such a tiny fraction of all that otherwise, what we're saying is otherwise a vast and empty three-dimensional plane, right, in which this singular star point is existing. But that doesn't seem to be the behavior. And the more that people that squiggle their way through to that star point, the more people will then in turn do that, right? And so you start to empower that label, right? And this is obviously how marketing works and, branding works, and, companies and manufacturers and producers of goods and services of all levels have, come to realize that it's not about describing the value of the good. It's about just like normalizing your sticker label so that when people look at products, they're going to pick the thing that they're familiar with because of that sense of doubt about, well, if everybody walks around with Nike logos all over the place and you're looking at products and then you see the Nike logo and you see this other thing, you're going to pick the Nike thing, right? And it's not rational, right? It's not actually like a, logic-driven, rationally reviewed action. It's just what we do because the sticker labeling is telling us what to do. And rational choice theory is usually what's used in traditional economic thinking, classical economic thinking, as a way to try to understand what's going on. And, one of the, validating aspects of it, which is at the same time the limiting aspect of it, is for people like Adam Smith, when they're Wealth of Nations and author and whatnot, people of this nature are sort of thinking about the world, and the sort of people with genuine agency in society as basically being people who are similar to them, in identity, right? And it's kind of these like, people of the same class, religion, education, ethnic background. And, obviously there are differences, but the scale of those differences in those people are very small compared to the total potentiality of difference when you look at, human population writ large. But, in that time, that was not the frame of thinking. And it doesn't mean that it was a good, it was informed by, ignorance, but that's what drove, right, and makes rational choice theory make sense. If you look at people, the more that people have in common, the more likely they're going to make the same rational decisions, because they are more likely to have the same mechanisms of thinking and reasoning, and they're going to be responsive to the same sticker values. And, in particular in that time when, their peers are influenced by the Enlightenment, in which rationality was like a popular behavior, probably more so then than it is now, unfortunately. Not that I would want to live in that time period. I'm not saying that things were better then. It's just simply the case that I think being rational and being intellectually curious is not as socially fashionable as it was at the time. So, it makes sense, though, in that cultural space to reach a conclusion like rational choice theory, which is that people are going to identify the very definable, tangible, impactful, positives and negatives to actions, and they're going to pick sort of the most optimal, right? The sort of mathematically correct, calculable solution. And if you extend this concept, though, into a domain or a space where you don't have that same kind of centralized, generic behavior around how people perceive what is and isn't rational, then you start to get to the limitation or the outer bound of that. And I think, things like Nash equilibrium are both rational and irrational. In a competitive situation, if you're racing, right, it makes sense to be as close to your competitor as possible. But we also see in endurance sports the strategy of, I'm going to run or ride or, basically establish a velocity that I can't maintain, but I think that I have a greater level of aerobic conditioning than this other individual. So I'm going to, in theory, bring them over their capacity and tire them out before I get tired. And then I might slow down, but they'll blow up. And so, you see that, this kind of Nash equilibrium effect doesn't mean that you're going to win, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to succeed. It's simply saying that's what people will do. And that most people don't feel that there's a position from which they can achieve any greater advantage. So this kind of process becomes reasons for engagement with things, that we're going to do things because we see them as being the do behaviors, and we are perhaps even more so motivated to avoid being associated with the don't behaviors. And if you go back to the doing 5 times a mile workout, that's definitely a product of that, phenomena, right? If that's a do behavior, people will do that. And people running, 1Ks and 2Ks in a culture or society that predominantly measures things in an imperial system. And even though they, have metric distance tracks, still tries to run the equivalent of, imperial distances, like the 1600 and the 3200. I mean, why? Just run the 1500 and the 3000. Nobody runs the 1600 and the 3200. But we're also not going to run the 2 mile or the mile, right? So you get into these weird situations that just don't really make any particular kind of sense, right? And why are high schoolers running the 1600 and going around talking about their mile time? All you have to do is back them up a few meters, and then they can actually talk about their mile time. And does that matter? Is it like a massive cultural crisis? Of course not. But at the same time, is it just sort of ridiculous and absurd to not just if it's a mile, make it a mile? Why can't we just run the mile? another easy example of this is how people are socially responsive towards different training speeds. And this is true in cycling, I think, as much as in running. And some people want to blame like the contemporary mediums and media through which we communicate and express and experience things. And I think that that's like totally inane. This idea of Strava and social media and this kind of stuff is, you see this pattern occur throughout the study of history, where, people in societies, at their contemporary time, start to get frustrated or irritated with patterns of human behavior. And then they just look at, well, what is something that's new or different? And we're going to blame it on that. And that's basically an extension of the belief that, if people would conform to the usual ways, or what people perceive to be the usual ways in their contemporary time, these issues wouldn't be happening. But when you look at this stuff across the scale of time, what you see is that, humans basically haven't really changed their behavior. We behave in the same ways, and then there's just like different tools or apparatuses, by which we're able to sort of like engage in that behavior. And so the aesthetics of the behavior are different. So the core behavior is not. For example, with Strava, I think this idea of, representing training as being, people are fast, and, people being like, oh, I used to be on Strava, but it's like such a toxic space, and these people make us feel like you have to run fast. So that's just, first of all, wrong. Some people are going out and they're exercising at the speed at which they want to exercise. It's, as a culture, we've labeled velocity in the context of sport as something that has significant sort of meaning. Okay. I got a Stride Power Pod finally a couple weeks ago, and I've been using that running, and, maybe I would eat my hat later for saying this, but I feel very confident after having used it multiple times in all the different kinds of training sessions that, I perform, that it's definitely, I would say, accurate. And I'm convinced of that. And I think the power, a watt is a watt. And I think that they're doing a very good job getting those watts, and certainly they're giving a consistent and constant data point that is is correlating very closely to effort, and sort of gives you a better way to sort of equivocate, or equalize between, different sessions over different kinds of terrain, etc. And one of the things that I've observed with this is when I go and I run lactate threshold intensity, I'm about 290 watts right now for that effort. And then I noticed that when I was like, okay, I'm going to go out and do like an easy run, right? Or just sort of like a comfortable, easier run, a run in the context of where I'm tired and I'm not looking to add fatigue and I'm looking to be more rested. I don't like to use the word recovery. There is going to be an episode down the road about recovery, but not today. And I discovered that when I was out running that my watts were like 230, 240. And I said, wow, if I was on the bike and I'm trying to go easy on the bike, I do not go this close to that intensity, right? I'm not 30, 40 watts, whatever, under that, right? Because I'm getting up towards 250 watts as I'm doing these easy runs. And so then I'm like, okay, I'm going to run and I'm going to keep it under 200 watts. And I'm running 11:30 pace. And it's like, unacceptable to me, basically, to do that. But I've been doing it anyway, because it's like, well, what do I have to lose? Is I'm not exactly setting any world records. So, one of the liberating factors of not being an elite athlete is that you can try different things, and if it doesn't really work, it doesn't matter, because you're not doing that for income, right? And so taking the liberation I've achieved through mediocrity has allowed me to sort of like experiment with things more freely, I think. It's appropriate to keep it down below that, and I can feel the benefit from that. And that's helpful, right? But without that kind of other information, the sticker labeling effect of 11:30 pace is very bad. And it is true that, on Strava, depending on who your peers are, or if you're somebody who uses Strava like, a consumer media platform where you like to follow a lot of like, notable elite level performers, but you're going to see people who go out and they run pretty fast all the time. People who seem to, like, I think a lot of college age athletes, runners, you tend to see this phenomena of everything has to be below 7-minute pace. And they're just always doing all of their activity below 7-minute pace because there's something, sticker labeling value of having that 6 something pace, right? And we've mentioned this sort of before in other contexts, but that's a really powerful thing. Or on the bike, right? Riding 20 miles an hour, and it's like, it would be really cool to be able to do all your rides at 20 miles an hour. But once you're riding 20 miles an hour, you're not going to care anymore because it's not exciting or significant. It's just your normal. So we pursue these things because we're like, in awe of the sticker label value, right? And then some people, that brings us back to people saying, well, I had to leave Strava because it's such a toxic space. And I just don't, it's not toxic. It's just people are doing what they're doing. And it proves my hypothesis, I would say, or provides evidence in support of that hypothesis that the perception of a consensus opinion that, well, I'm, experiencing nonconformity stress, I'm experiencing anxiety because I'm seeing people do these things that I'm not doing. And if I try to go out and create those, it fails. And, people they can't handle that information. I can't look at what people are doing and see that as being effective. But that's because you're looking at it as a dichotomy, right? It's like, and it's weird how we perceive the aggregate of individual training decisions to then be representative of the do behavior versus the don't behavior. And I'm just going to keep running 11:30 pace on these runs, and unless I lose a significant amount of body weight, the reality is it's not likely that, or if I see a significant increase in higher level aerobic fitness, I'm going to sort of be continuing to cruise around at 200 watts and to 180 watts and 190 watts. And that's going to continue to be 10:30 to 11:30 pace. That's just kind of how it is. And I don't know that that's like a bad thing, but that is the thing. That's kind of like where it is at. And, when I was coaching cross country, we had Baker's dozen or so athletes running between 1640 and 1530 for 5,000 meters cross country. And we would do the workouts and the sessions. And I think that the bias, the sticker value bias there is to always be like, oh yeah, well, it was these particular sessions and, these are the workouts. But the thing that we did more frequently is we ran really slow. And I took those athletes out and I took them on the runs in between. I was, doing my exercise, right? But I, don't weigh 140 pounds anymore and wasn't in like particularly great shape. So we'd be out probably running 9-minute pace, which, for me felt like, oh, okay, whatever, right? Didn't feel like 11:30 pace slow, but to me it was sort of like, oh, we're out here jogging along, but I still feel, that I'm doing enough activity that I'm enjoying, sort of doing some level of exercise. But if you're running, what they're running, people running 430s, 420s who can run that for the mile, out running 9-minute pace, 9:30 pace, a lot of the time, like that's probably like me running 11:30 pace, So, but, and for them, that was always sort of a bit of a thing of like, well, we're running so slow, but we raced very frequently. And so they were just constantly getting these, evidence of like, well, I'm racing fast. And when you get to, or because you're in a team environment, you have to do that many races. And then they're always, they're going well, the majority of the time, and you're improving, it's very evident to you that you're getting faster. It's easy to be like, yeah, forget it. But for a lot of us, as sort of independent amateur athletes who race if and when we feel like it, the training becomes an even more significant aspect of what we're doing. And it's not sort of, oh, I've got this race coming up, so I'm doing my routine before the race. It's sort of, the training starts to become an aspect of performance in and of itself. And so I would, of course, agree that, things like Strava and, people's YouTube workout vlogs allow us to see training in different ways that we couldn't before. But I also think that the reality is we have sort of a cognitive capacity to look for performance and make comparisons with or without something like Strava. It's just the social means by which we do it changes. And so then people act like they've, rediscovered or, here is the problem with society is Strava segments, whatever. So let's shift from dichotomous thinking then. Okay, how could we think about this instead? Well, I like the idea of things existing on kind of a spectrum or a continuum. So if we think of this continuum, it's not a dichotomy anymore, but I will define for you why I think the dichotomy can be derived from this. So at the base of this, we have a null point. This is the point at which whatever you're doing for training is not having any impact. It's not contributing to what you're doing. There's that, and I'm paraphrasing very loosely, but there's that, Peter Coe thing that, if you can't explain why you're doing something, you shouldn't be doing it. And I'm sort of conflicted about, Peter Coe in terms of being kind of like a all-knowing guru or oracle of training. But I do think that that's very insightful / obvious, that don't do something unless you know why you're doing it, right? That's kind of fits into the duh category of things. And I think if we think about, things having a purpose, the null point would be, it could be as something as basic as just being asleep is going to have no impact. But there's a scale of activity you can escalate from the state of being asleep, physical activity where you're still experiencing kind of a null state. And the nullness of it is kind of diminishing, but it's still effectively null. And as you progress and you elevate and, whatever, you go from walking to running speed or whatever, increase your watts on the bicycle, at some point you reach kind of an effective point where you're going to actually be producing something as a consequence of your energy or effort. And as we progress beyond that effective point, there's going to be sort of increasing effectiveness where per unit of work, you're exchanging that for greater unit of response, greater unit of benefit. And then their next point on this spectrum that I would define is kind of the diminished point. And I would say this is the point at which when you continue to add additional sort of units of work, you see a smaller level of return, right? And this would be diminishing returns in economics. It doesn't mean that you're not producing things, by the way. It just means that, the return is diminishing and the additional, you're receiving less profit relative to expenditure, if you will. And then as you go past that, then you will reach a point, and I'll just call it the non-point, where you're nothing you're doing is beneficial to you. You sort of reach that point of failure. So you could draw a break point on this spectrum anywhere. Let's say we draw this break point, probably the most logical place to put it would be to put it right through that effective point. And we can say everything to the left of that is a don't behavior. And then that effective point, that's the do behavior, right? But they're not A and B. They're not, singularity things. They're continuum things where you can do one thing or the other. There's an opportunity to do a variety of different strategies and approaches as you're looking at what you're trying to accomplish in training. I think this means that good training decisions and decisions about process towards accomplishment X, right? Whatever specific target somebody is trying to work towards and achieve or attain, that shouldn't be driven by other people's behavior, because people's behaviors are falling on this spectrum, and these spectrums have to be relative to ourselves. So you can't make decisions about how fast you should run or how fast you should ride or how many watts you should produce. The reality is you can make these decisions. We should be really saying that you shouldn't make these decisions, because people certainly do make decisions in this manner. You shouldn't make decisions based on what you're seeing other people doing, because even if they are getting awesome results from that only is successful because it's on their spectrum of null to effective to diminished to non, right? It's on their space, right? And even if you can run the exact same times as somebody, or even if you have the exact same FTP as somebody, that doesn't mean that you should be doing what they're doing, because the domain of influencing factors is not constant for everybody. It simply isn't. And, we can extend this to, saying that the elite result is not the probable result. The average result is the probable result. Why does this statement matter? I think it matters because we seem to see in that idea of the elite result the sticker value. That if people can pull out an exemplar athlete and say, well, I had this athlete did blank. Well, there are coaches every single season. Right now in New England, right, the weather is becoming nicer out, right? It's warmer, right? The leaves are on the trees, the flowers are blooming, and that means it's time for outdoor track. And that also means it's time for some, coaches, I think, unfortunately fall into this pattern of, well, if you had the one athlete, and we've mentioned this before on the podcast, so if you've listened to a lot of episodes, this is not a new concept, but it's, very pertinent here too. That if you've had the one athlete, then it's like, well, that's the result. That if you really do these things, this is what is possible, and that's the elite result. And so that's a sticker labeling phenomena. That that athlete's success, right, or those performances or those PRs, that the best PRs that were produced by any individual of all the individuals who have consumed that training process, that singular elite result, right, which could be a total outlier, becomes the sticker label. It's like, well, I once coached an athlete to do blank. Okay, well, we've talked about in the Deus Ex Machina episodes about how misleading that concept could be. That athlete probably would have achieved a comparable outcome in every other situation. The question is how many people, what percentage of your athletes are doing well. And yes, it does matter, if the athletes aren't doing what you want them to do, then yeah, you can't really conclude whether or not that works. But sometimes it's the case that if athletes aren't doing what you want them to do, then find something else, okay? Because that also exists on the spectrum. But we seem to see the exception, and as the kind of expression of the rule, right? So that elite result, that sort of thing that is perhaps the exception to the rule, the outlier, is seen to be the thing that matters. Because in American culture, and probably by extension a lot of developed market democracies, we want to, and perhaps out of societal stability purposes we need to, I don't know, but we want to believe, certainly, in the fallacy that we can all be that exception, okay? It's I'm going to be rich is a ridiculous statement, because the concept of richness is relativistic. Wow, people running times. Well, what you're kind of seeing now is that, times run at, junior level athletes, high school level, college level athletes in general are going up significantly due to whatever, composite variable shift that's changing, right? So that means, that elite result is now less and less valuable, okay? And, that sticker labeling, right, is shifting. And I think that's what we want to be recognizing, is that what we're being presented with as the due behavior is that singular point floating in that space. But that's because that's what we've chosen to illuminate. And rather than say, wow, how can we have all of this other space? Why should we just assume that it's just sort of empty? And that what we need to do is all scramble to play king of the hill on this one particular point. And a metaphor here would be to imagine a sheer, imposing cliff face. Okay. And at the top of that cliff, that's where you see your absolute potential. Okay, what could you, because there is a limit ultimately to how fast you can run or ride your bike. There's a limit, right? I mean, at absolute best, right, you can't exceed the speed of light. So there is a limit, okay? This idea that people will just get faster indefinitely and is just absurd. Obviously, that can't happen. So that limit, right, exists somewhere for everybody. As individuals, we have an absolute limit. And that's, and that limit is also limited in part by our life circumstance, right? That's a part of that phenomena. And now imagine, an attempt to scale this sheer cliff face using two different ladders. But imagine this cliff face is so high and it just sort of extends into the night sky, and people can't perceive there to be a point at which the cliff face ends and then the sky begins. So it just sort of seems to be this indefinite plane. And, in this concept, the goal is to scramble up the side of this. And so, people, as individual, right, arrives at this cliff face with two ladders. So I want to see how high up this cliff face can I get? And one ladder has 10 rungs and the other ladder has 30 rungs. Now, which ladder is going to get you higher up the cliff face? Okay, the ladder with 30 rungs is going to get you higher up. And that's very easy to see, right? And so neither of these ladders are reaching the actual top of the cliff. But what they're doing is they're changing the product potential, right? So the absolute potential is not being attained by either of these methods, but one of them, in one of these methods, the product potential is closer to the absolute potential than the other. And this, I think, is the concept of what training really is about. It's about trying to make decisions about what we should or shouldn't do. And it's not just that there are two ladders. It's about figuring out how to design the ladder with the requisite number of rungs that are going to get us to our absolute potential. And I think sometimes we see with training culture that there are these sort of generic methods and methodologies about how we should or shouldn't work. And, it's sort of like the discernment between outcomes is sort of on the basis of talent. And, what we do, though, isn't a product of talent. It's a product of process. The talent illusion is simply because some of us are more responsive to given processes. You can have an athlete training 25 hours a week outdoors on their road bike, following all of the, best sticker label practices of that, being at that Nash equilibrium. They're able to really conform to all the narratives that we see about this stuff out there. And then you could have an athlete who might be training 12 hours a week, and they might be doing indoor riding and running. And both of those athletes could be at the same level of fitness. So ask yourself, which of those two ladders is sort of taller? And I would say that the 25-hour-a-week ladder is the 10-foot ladder, and the 12-hour-a-week ladder is the 30-foot ladder. Okay, now maybe they're both only 5 rungs up that ladder. Maybe they're both 8 rungs up that ladder. Because if you're 25 hours a week, realistically, what's your room to apply further intervention towards improvement? Very little, right? So if that's all that you're allowed to do to train, right? If that's your due behavior, right? And that's what you have to do that because the stress or the anxiety of not conforming to that is overwhelming. Okay, you have now limited your product potential, okay, as something that is going to be much lower than your absolute potential. And you're probably not going to really improve much more. And people will just sort of be like, well, that's how good you are. Well, no, that's how good you are given that intervention set. If you use a different intervention set, the other example, the 12-hour-a-week example of doing some other forms of fitness and exercise, well, what's your potential to add there? Well, significant, right? Significantly more potential to add, interventions around practice that will lead to improvement. And so what we want to be asking is the question, how do we create growth in training or in approaches, frankly, to anything in a general sense? I think to do this, we have to change our metrics of self-evaluation. What does self-evaluation mean? It means, where was I before? Where am I now? Can I specifically define the things that are allowing me to be better, right? Is that a real, definable, discernible thing, right? And what scale of improvement do I have to still make? And, that's going to be influenced by our sense of process, okay? Is if you think that the 25 hours a week of conventional, standardized, this is how you do it training, that's the history of the development of training, is that people in the contemporary sense believe very deeply in that sticker value. And they say, well, this is what you should be doing. But if you do what that sticker value label is, you're not going to have the outcome of the elite person who slaps that sticker on their t-shirt. You're going to have the outcome of the average person who slaps that sticker on their t-shirt. If you have a coach who coached a 4:05 high school miler, I don't know, like random number, right? But something that you would think was pretty special, right? And nobody else has ever run under 4:45, and they've coached 500 other athletes, okay? What's more likely, that you're going to run 4:05 or that you're never going to break 4:40 or 4:45? I think it's pretty obvious what the answer is. But, that elite bias, that, mythologization of, I'm the special person, is very powerful, and it's very much a siren song that I think lures us, onto the rocks of poor decision making. And I think what we really want to be cultivating, okay, isn't this idea of conforming to things where we're responding to, how do I alleviate my feelings of anxiety? I think we want to be in this space where we're working towards immersion, and we want to cultivate the immersion complex. And I think that's the maximum state of engagement. When we're maximally engaged, that's when we generate maximum practice, because that immersion is something that we want to sustain. That's the intrinsic motivation, is the desire to feel good. And immersion is something that feels good. Okay, it elevates us out of kind of a humdrum alienated existence, and it gives us a sense of meaningfulness and purpose. And I'm sure a lot of people have experienced immersion. It could be reading books, watching TV shows, watching movies, playing video games. Maybe it's eating something, cooking something. But that's, listening to your favorite music, right? It's a sense where you don't really perceive whether or not time goes by, right? This is very much similar to the idea of flow psychology. But getting into that state of immersion, right? In that state, because we want to sustain that, we're now going to maximize our behaviors to maximize immersion, right? Kind of in the way that when people have a compelling, addiction, right? That they'll maximize the behaviors that are going to allow them to maximize their engagement with that thing. And, so it's not what things to do, right? It's not, should I do 5 times a mile, but how much rest should I take? How fast should I run them? Okay. It's really whether or not we do it. Okay, can you run 5 times a mile twice a week for 6 months? And that's really hard because it takes a lot of patience, okay, to sort of wait for that to play out, because you're not going to see those results on the scale of 4 to 6 weeks. And, to be honest, I, always struggle with this. And I think that's a common phenomenon, is you're well, am I wasting my time? But that concept of I'm wasting my time, that's defaulting to that dichotomy of do behavior, don't behavior. Right? Does this not work? Well, if you're doing something that's kind of challenging, if you given enough time of practice, it will work. That's just what happens. So, too much, I think, too much behavior, right, around drawing lines in the sand with sticks. Okay. What we're trying to do is we're trying to hit moving targets. And I think too many coaches and athletes view training as a process of control versus a process of problem solving. I need to control these athletes and get them to do what I want. Or we think that we need to then control ourselves and get our, lazy self to do what our disciplined self wants. And I think ultimately the challenge isn't forcing conformity to what is ultimately an arbitrary system. Okay, I think the challenge is making what might be perceived as conformity to an outsider be to the insider the product of our immersive mindset. To do that, we have to separate ourselves from this sticker labeling view of things and ask ourselves instead, how do we get engaged in what we're trying to do? How can we cultivate the practices that are going to allow us to improve? And we need to be looking at this stuff in that self-referencing context and say, am I improving? Am I getting better? Do I have room to add to this? And if you're feeling that you're either very good at something, very bad at something, or somewhere ambiguously in between those two things, those two states of being, ask yourself, how much more room do I have to improve with this current thing that I'm doing? And if the answer is not much, then maybe it's time to switch to something else where the potential to improve within that model is much greater. Because if you can improve more in that model, you're going to get closer to your absolute potential. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Black Cats Run. We're on Instagram. If you want to check us out in that space, we welcome you to do so. If you've enjoyed this episode or other episodes, we'd love it if you'd take a moment to recommend it to somebody else that you think would find it interesting. Thanks for listening again. We'll catch you next time.